One day, it just happens. You look over at your younger sibling and realize that to meet their eye, you've gotta look up. The horror dawns on you as you understand that your days of pushing them around are over. What's that about? You two have the same parents, so why is your little sibling suddenly taller than you? It turns out that the why of human stature is pretty complicated. It's not just genetic, though that's a big part of it. Here's the long and short of it all. To understand height, we need to bone up on anatomy, specifically bones. We were all born smaller than we are today, and our bones go through a lot to get us to our full adult sizes. But when you're born, your bones aren't just mini versions of the full-sized ones. A lot of them aren't even just one bone. Lots of our long bones, like the femur or humerus, are formed when 3 or more pieces fused together. You've got the diaphysis, which is the middle shaft part, the epiphysis, which is the very end, and the metaphysis, which is just the name for the part of the shaft closest to the epiphysis. And right between the metaphysis and epiphysis, you've got a growth plate made up of cartilage cells called chondrocytes. During early years and adolescence, these growth plate cells are hyperactive, dividing and making loads of cartilage in intricate patterns. Blood vessels start to occupy this cartilage matrix, bringing in cells called osteoblasts, which work to turn the matrix into solid bone. Keeping the epiphysis separate means there's more room to get that shaft section of the bone as long as possible, because your growth plate is able to just build on the free end of that bone, instead of having to stretch from the middle. All that long bone growth winds down at the end of puberty. That's when the growth plates settle down into maintenance mode, and all the separate parts of the bones have started fusing together. Your body's hormones are what trigger all of this bone growth. The one creatively named growth hormone is the biggie, and that comes from the pituitary gland. Growth hormone tells the chondrocytes and osteoblasts to make more of themselves, and the more growth hormone you have, the more they'll grow. Another important hormone is insulin-like growth factor 1, which promotes survival and migration of our bone-making cells. Hormones often modulate each other, and this is the case for growth hormone and IGF-1. Sex hormones, like testosterone and estrogen, also play a role in bone growth. Testosterone does this a bit more than estrogen does, which is part of why people assigned male at birth are usually taller than those assigned female at birth. Now that we know the mechanics of it all, let's get into why not everyone gets to be pro basketball player sized. And the answer is your parents. One of the first researchers to spend time studying height variation was Francis Galton in the 1880s. He noted that height seems to be really heritable in families, meaning that children would usually grow to within a couple standard deviations of their parents' adult heights. With modern gene sequencing, we can put a number on just how much of our stature is genetic, and as it turns out, it's a lot. Some researchers estimate that 80 to 90% of height is controlled by genetics. Height is polygenic, meaning lots of genes contribute to the trait. All of the small variations in those genes have an additive impact. For starters, some height-determining genes are found on the X and Y chromosomes, so that can contribute to sex-related differences in height. It's hard to know exactly how many genes play a role, but a 2025 review estimated that there's about 600 genes with a known contribution. Plus, sometimes variations in the DNA around genes can affect height too, because those bits of DNA can influence how often those height-controlling genes get read. That 600 gene number doesn't include those non-coding bits of DNA, which means there are possibly thousands of spots in your genome that work together to determine whether you can reach the top shelf or not. These variants can be super subtle, sometimes just a single nucleotide change. Many of these subtle DNA variants that influence height have been found using genome-wide association studies. These studies compare the genomes of loads of people to identify any sequences that show up more in taller people than shorter, or vice versa. With statistical data analysis, it's possible to see correlations between height and DNA variations, even if the effect is pretty small. But we also know there are genes that play a much bigger role. However, when a single gene is known to have a big impact on height, those genes tend to be associated with syndromes, meaning that height impact can come with a few side effects. Some mutations are dominant, meaning a mutation in just one gene copy is sufficient to cause the syndrome. Sometimes these mutations arise spontaneously, rather than being passed down from the parents. An example is Marfan syndrome, which results in increased height, but often causes heart defects too. People with Marfan syndrome have a mutation where their bodies don't make enough of a protein called fibrillin 1, which is a major component of our connective tissues, like cartilage. But fibrillin 1 is part of the bone protein matrix, too. And based on studies in mouse models, scientists think fibrillin 1's role in the bones is to slow down bone growth, not speed it up. That's why decreasing the amount of it that you have can lead to increased height. Another height-related syndrome is achondroplasia, one of the most common causes of dwarfism in humans. Quick note here, we're using the word dwarfism because that's the medical term, but most people with these conditions prefer to use terms like little person or short-statured to describe themselves. In the case of achondroplasia, the mutation causes the bones to not produce enough chondrocytes, and since those are our most active in our long bones, that's why people with this mutation tend to have shorter limbs. Other gene mutations affecting height are recessive, meaning the condition only manifests if you have mutations in both copies of the mutated gene. An example of this is Leembruggen syndrome, where there are mutations in both copies of the gene that make your growth hormone receptors, so they won't respond to growth hormone. This leads to shorter stature and delayed puberty. The type of gene mutation is pretty important too. For instance, different mutations in the HMGA2 gene can cause extreme shortness, extreme tallness, or influence normal height variation, depending on which part of the gene is mutated. So genetics is pretty important when it comes to height, but it's not everything. That's especially clear when you look at twins, since identical twins have the same genes, but are often different heights. It's kind of like cooking. The genes that go into determining height are like your body's recipe, giving the cells instructions to make the proteins that do the work of growing your bones. But to make those proteins, your body also needs raw materials, ingredients if you will. And this is where your environment comes in. But before we get to that, all research needs funding, even ours. So here's a quick ad break.
Thanks to our presidents of science, Harry Plumley, Charlie Stanley, and TJ Stein for supporting this SciShow video. With the help of our awesome patrons, including but not limited to the presidents of science, we can afford writers, script editors, fact checkers, hosts, video editors, producers, animators, motion designers, and sound designers who work on every single SciShow video. That's a lot of talented professionals who all need to be compensated for the hours they pour into any given SciShow video. But could you imagine any of our videos without animations or jokes or accuracy or any of these people's contributions? Absolutely not. So we are endlessly grateful to the presidents of science for helping us pay everybody on the SciShow team for their work. You can join them at patreon.com/SciShow. Donate responsibly.
When we say that the environment affects our height, we're not just talking about pollution, though that does seem to be linked to a decrease in stature. We're talking about the environment more broadly. Things like the condition a person grows up in or their nutrition all add up and play parts in determining adulthood height. You can only reach the height that your genes want you to if your body has all the building blocks it needs. Growing takes calories, and making your bones correctly also requires the right vitamin and mineral building blocks. Calcium is the most obvious one. Our bones need it to mineralize, so low calcium intake can lead to shorter stature. Low vitamin D intake can also decrease growth, because vitamin D actually helps your body absorb as much calcium as possible from your food. Too little vitamin D during childhood can cause rickets, which causes the bones to curve and buckle under the body's weight. Not good. This is also why most commercially available milk is fortified with vitamin D, since that helps you get the most calcium out of every glass, whether it's cow's milk or plant-based. And when it comes to calories and overall macronutrients, you need both quantity and quality. A 2014 study found that the greatest environmental factor in determining adult stature for Europeans was the ratio of high-quality protein, like dairy, fish, and meat, to low-quality protein, primarily wheat. People living in countries with lower GDPs tend to have limited access to varied, nutrient-dense diets, and the nutrient deficiencies that come with poverty can end up reducing someone's stature. But fortunately, the inverse is true too. We've seen a worldwide increase in average human height over the last century, partially thanks to improved nutrition. That's actually plateauing now, and there's still plenty of places where food access is insufficient, but it's still nice to see. For environmental factors, the influence can begin pretty early, like in utero early. There are some studies that show a correlation between consuming caffeine and smaller babies at birth. While the current recommendation says up to 200 milligrams of caffeine per day is okay during a pregnancy, a 2022 study found that people who consumed even less caffeine than that while pregnant had smaller babies than people who'd had no caffeine during their pregnancy. Plus, those smaller babies were still shorter than the control group at age 8, although like the children themselves, that effect wasn't huge. By the way, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that caffeine consumption by children affects their growth, but it does appear to stunt bone growth in mice going through puberty. But since caffeine isn't great for kids for other reasons, you might not want to caffeinate your kiddos. Plus, things that result in lower birth weight can sometimes be hard to come back from even outside the womb. One study on size difference in twins found that 91% of the twins that were smaller at birth were still the shorter one, even years later. Researchers think this is a reflection of differences in nutrient access in utero, meaning that the conditions we're all exposed to in utero can affect our height forever. Another part of your environment that can affect your height is disease. Identical twin studies show that infections in early years of life led to differences in height of more than 2 centimeters by adulthood. And according to one study, that trend held when including less serious conditions in the infection calculation too, like diarrhea or stomach bugs. Just being sick more often can result in reduced stature. And here's where my cooking metaphor from earlier gets complicated. Your environment can affect how well your body makes hormones, meaning that your ingredients alter the ability to execute the recipe. I guess it's kind of like if you want to make cookies, but your recipe calls for brown sugar and you don't have any. You can swap to white sugar, but going off book means that the cookies you make aren't identical to what the recipe would have made without substitutions. The genes tell your body what hormones to make and how much, and environmental factors determine if your body can actually follow those orders. And then these hormones regulate how your skeleton grows and when it decides to call it a day and stop growing. So, your genes set up your stature trajectory before you're even born. Then, environmental influences from pre-birth to puberty play their part, mediating your hormones and all adding up to your final adult height. It's worth mentioning that while you gain height in your youth, you'll likely lose height in your later years. That's because spinal discs wear down over time and they compact with age. Gravity plus friction. Stupid physics. And hey, if the fact that your height is basically entirely up to chance is a bummer, I get it. There are perks to being tall. There's a positive correlation between height and income, which is likely because of social biases toward tallness. But despite what popular culture may tell you, being tall isn't always worth it. Taller people are at greater risk of developing cancer overall, particularly breast and colorectal cancers in women. Why this is, we're not quite sure, though there are theories. It could just be that tall people have more cells, therefore more potential for something to go wrong. And the hormones that affect our height are often doing more than one thing in our bodies. For example, growth hormone regulates height, but it also regulates cell proliferation in general. So it's not that surprising that people with growth hormone receptor deficiency are both shorter and less likely to get cancer. That said, being short isn't some kind of protection against all disease all the time. Shorter heights are sometimes correlated with greater risk of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and osteoarthritis. We don't know whether it's the predisposition to these diseases that slows your growth, or whether being short itself puts you at risk for these conditions. So there's still plenty of work to be done to understand it all. To make a long story short, height is complicated. There's a lot going on to make your body the size that it is, whether you're a short king or future NBA player. Whatever it says on your driver's license, you can stand tall knowing that we like you just the way you are.